He was a man in two worlds. One foot in the classical realm of Newton and Maxwell, the other in the new regime of relativity and the quantum. He was on equally good terms with the experimentalists at Manchester and Cavendish, most notably Rutherford, and with the German theorists who work with pencil and paper would guide physics for 30 years, including Einstein, whose insights would radically alter how humanity thought of nearly every aspect of the universe. He lived also in the spaces between physics and philosophy and science and politics, and by doing so was able to construct pathways between the theoretical and the practical to create places for human beings not only to exist, but to grow and thrive. In all of this, Niels Bohr can be said to be the great bridge builder of the 20th century. In his life, he helped construct some of the first bridges from the classical to the quantum worldview. He then created, in Copenhagen, an institute for the great minds of European physics to discuss the ideas, both scientific and philosophical, that resulted in a reinterpretation of the nature of matter that still holds today. When the climate of Europe turned from embracing intellectual openness and the free pursuit of ideas to one concerned only with ideological purity based in racial hatred and nationalistic bigotry, he again provided a bridge for those seeking to flee persecution and find a place where they could live without fear. And finally, when those who would exterminate whole peoples were beaten back and their ideas discredited, he worked tirelessly to try to build a bridge to a world where the darker and more bitter fruits of the research he and so many others had done would not poison the peace so many had died to make a possibility. His was a remarkable life which saw two devastating wars and two great revolutions, one scientific and one political, and through it all he remained a singular figure standing for the ideal in Western culture that the greatest purpose for the human spirit was to flourish. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 2, A History of the Atom. Episode 13.1, Supplemental, Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr was born in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1885 to a well-educated and well-connected family. His father, Christian, was a professor of physiology at the University of Copenhagen who made a number of important scientific contributions to that field. His mother was the daughter of a wealthy Danish-Jewish family that was successful in both banking and prominent in parliamentary circles. They were in a family that embraced the post-Enlightenment ideal of modernity with its faith in inevitable human progress, the rejection of tradition in favor of scientific rationality, the embracing of personal freedoms and equality, and the focus on the individual. While Victorian England was flush with the confidence of empire and industry, and the great powers of Europe pursued greatness through political and colonial pursuits, Denmark's time in that game had passed. Gone was its Scandinavian empire, and so it resolved itself, along with Sweden, to be a more minor player on the world stage, while pursuing policies and endeavors that would lead to the betterment of its people. The Bohr family could be said to be the very embodiment of this pursuit. They were reasonably well off, engaged in intellectual pursuits that challenged both their minds and their spirits, while also lifting the fortunes of those around them. There were 3 children, of which Niels was the second. His older sister Jenny would become a teacher, while his younger brother Harald would be a well-known football player and then mathematician. Both Niels and Harald played for Copenhagen's academic football club, with Harald being good enough to make Denmark's 1908 Olympic football team. In a household which embraced the virtues of kindness and cooperation over competition and conflict, The two boys grew up as not only brothers, but as close friends who worked for each other's betterment. Like many of the great scientific figures of the time, Neil was a well-rounded child growing up. He learned of the great heritage of European thought and embraced it fully. As an undergraduate at the University of Copenhagen, he studied physics, mathematics, and philosophy beginning in 1903. In 1905, he did his first research as a part of a competition sponsored by the Royal Danish Academy of Arts and Letters. This work, focused on hydrodynamics, required him to master not only the complex theory of the subject, but also a number of difficult experimental tasks. It was remarkable work for an undergraduate, extending both the theoretical understanding of the topic and developing new experimental methods. Even though his paper to the Academy was submitted at the last minute, he still won the competition and later, with some continued improvements, was able to submit the paper and have it accepted for publication by the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions. In 1909, Bohr earned his master's degree, followed by a Doctor of Philosophy in 1911. His research for both degrees focused on electron transport in metals. In his work, he considered the ideas of Heinrich Lorentz, who had put forward a theory about how electrons move through a metal. Lorentz had postulated that the electrons could be thought of as behaving like a gas in the metal. This model, while partially effective in explaining some of the phenomena of current in conductors, failed in certain key areas. Bohr set out to improve the description, which he did by refining the models Lorentz used. But more importantly, he showed that not only was the hypothesis completely unable to explain how conductors behave magnetically, but that it actually never could explain that. His thesis showed that a classical picture based on Maxwell's electrodynamics could never account for why certain metals were strongly magnetic, what we call ferromagnetic, while others did not magnetize. In other words, Bohr showed that it was impossible, using the ideas of the time, to explain why iron could be made into a permanent magnet while aluminum could not. As many commentators have noted, this was truly groundbreaking work, especially for one as young as Bohr. But it basically went unnoticed at the time, as the University of Copenhagen required its students to publish their thesis work in Danish rather than the more frequently read German. Bohr's results would be independently arrived at in the doctoral work of Johanna van Leeuwen in 1919, where they would come to the notice of the broader scientific community. While finishing his thesis work, Niels met the sister of a mathematician friend, Marguerite Norland, in 1910. The two would pursue a 2-year-long courtship that was interrupted by Bohr's 1911 postdoctoral fellowship. Bohr's work, while not broadly read, did get the attention of J.J. Thomson at the Cavendish Lab in Cambridge. Bohr was invited to join the group there for a year, and while he did do some work in the lab, he just wasn't quite the right fit. Thomson was focused on the work with cloud chambers and cathode ray tubes, and Bohr's research in electron transport and electromagnetism wasn't part of the mainstream effort at the lab. However, as I mentioned in the last episode, Bohr did meet Rutherford at the 1911 Christmas party, and after traveling to Manchester to meet the New Zealander, Bohr quickly decided to spend the second half of his fellowship there. The two men instantly bonded, with Rutherford acting as something of a surrogate father for Bohr, while Bohr became the son Rutherford never had. Bohr was strongly affected by the familiar atmosphere of the research group, which contained Geiger, Marsden, and many others. He was drawn into the Sunday lunches at the Rutherfords' home and the comradely environment the professor created at the university. It was the perfect place for Bohr to find his feet, and soon he became interested in trying to fix Rutherford's model of the atom, specifically the place and motion of electrons. Why was Bohr attracted to this program of research? Well, it seems that Bohr had a desire to look at problems where established physics or established ideas seemed to fail at explaining what was seen in nature. Such had been the case in his work on electron transfer, where he focused on trying to resolve and understand the failures of the Lorentz model, and this seems to have also been the case here. Rutherford's model explained the scattering results, and almost nothing else. Thomson's model was now obviously wrong, and Nagaoka's model was profoundly unstable. However, Bohr saw that each model had elements that worked and elements that didn't, and was drawn to the idea that he might be able to offer real contributions to what was going on. What Bohr realized was that the nuclear model did a good job of explaining the nucleus, and so there wasn't much work needed there. The other models offered a structure for the electron configuration that might provide a starting point that explained the line spectra that had been observed and cataloged by Kirchhoff and Bunsen. This introduction to the problem and the initial attempts to solve it would be what Bohr would take with him when he returned to Copenhagen in 1912. What he would also take with him is the way in which science was done at Manchester. The daily discussions, the guidance from a leading figure, the reliance on and guiding power of physical intuition, and a real desire to work on important problems with the aim of rigorously understanding what was really going on. Upon his work return to Denmark, Bohr was allowed to take an unpaid position with the university as sort of a person who could lecture on various topics for a fee to be paid by the students, and who could supervise doctoral work. A year later, this position would be upgraded to include a salary, much like the lecturer position now seen in England and the United States. It was also in 1912 that Niels and Marguerite were married. The two would go on to have 6 sons, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. All of the boys would become professional, as one might expect, and Age Bohr, like his father, would earn a Nobel Prize in physics. More than this, however, Marguerite would take an active role in helping her husband establish the powerfully collegial environment, something they would both become known for. It is hard to imagine Niels having nearly the impact on European physics had it not been for this intimate partnership between the two of them. The two would honeymoon in Scotland and England, with Niels continuing to correspond with Rutherford about his ideas on electron structure and how he was working them out. In 1913, Bohr published a series of 3 papers, known as the Trilogy, that described this classical quantum solution to the nature of electron orbits. I described this solution in some detail in the last episode, so I won't go over it here again, but its use of Planck's quantum in a way similar to Einstein's description for explaining the photoelectric effect was groundbreaking and pushed theoretical physics off in a completely new direction. While Rutherford and Thomson were pursuing the nucleus through experimental means in England, Bohr's work would make it clear to a new generation of physicists in Europe that the best pathway to understanding what was going on in matter was to take a much closer look at this strange quantum phenomenon. Another result of the trilogy was that it made Bohr a well-known name in physics circles. Bohr was quickly growing tired of teaching physics to medical students, something, by the way, this writer can occasionally sympathize with. So when Rutherford offered Bohr an associate professorship in Manchester, teaching physics to physics students, the Dane jumped at the chance. Taking a leave of absence from Copenhagen, Bohr set out on a working holiday through Europe before going to Manchester. One of the stops was to visit a physicist by the name of Arnold Sommerfeld in Munich. This visit had 2 really important results. The first was to convince Sommerfeld that research in the new quantum approach was truly worthwhile. This conversation with one of the most gifted physicists in Germany at the time was not only important in its own right, but as Sommerfeld was professor of physics at Munich, he directed a number of the best graduate students into the study of this approach. These would include names such as Werner Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli, who would be so important in moving quantum theory beyond Bohr's initial work. The second outcome of the visit was that Sommerfeld was able to, a little over a year later, make some significant improvements to Bohr's model, allowing it to be extended to more complex electron configurations and explain phenomena such as the Zeeman effect. Unfortunately, it was at this time that World War I broke out, and that made any sort of work in physics, especially in the combatant nations, very difficult. While Denmark remained neutral in the war, Bohr was caught in the Central Powers, namely Germany and Austria, while trying to make his way to an Entente power, Britain. Eventually, he was able to get back to Denmark and then find passage to England. But I really wonder if this experience didn't profoundly affect his outlook when, after early 1933, many scientists would need help in escaping the increasingly repressive regimes in Germany and Italy. In Manchester, Bohr continued his work with Rutherford, who, in 1916, offered to create a position for Bohr at the university to get him to stay long-term. The University of Copenhagen, realizing that they were on the verge of losing one of their most gifted scientists, made Bohr a counteroffer to fill a newly created chair in theoretical physics there. While Bohr was deeply attached to Rutherford and the group at Manchester, he missed Copenhagen as an extended family even more. Returning in 1916, he found that the University of Copenhagen, while creating the position, had actually not been particularly generous with space to house a research program. As a result of this, Bohr tapped into his vast network of connections and began raising money to create a semi-independent research institute. Between 1917 and 1921, he shook a lot of hands and made a lot of presentations, and eventually opened the Copenhagen Institute for Theoretical Physics, later to be renamed the Niels Bohr Institute. This center would stand alongside the Curie Institute and the Cavendish Laboratory as one of the premier centers of physics research, albeit theoretical, in Europe throughout the 1920s and 30s. The Institute was really an outgrowth of Bohr's view on how human beings best did work. Drawing from the rich, family-centered, and cooperative childhood he had, and his experience working at Manchester with Rutherford, Bohr created a place where students and fellow physicists could come together and work in an informal environment that fostered collaboration and open discussion. He and his family lived in a set of apartments at the Institute, with other space given over to a lecture hall, a library, and seminar rooms. There were a number of offices for the researchers working with the Institute, as well as for visiting scientists, of which there were many. Finally, there was a lunchroom where, as Gino Segre describes, there was always good coffee and good Danish bread with cheese. During the 1920s alone, over 60 physicists from all over the world came to do work at the Institute, sometimes for years at a time. In the environment of the Institute, they lived, worked, studied, ate, and played together. In many ways, the Institute was as close to scientific nirvana as one could find during those years. Starting in 1929 and each year afterwards, Bohr would invite the best and brightest physicists in both theoretical and experimental research to Copenhagen for a couple of weeks to engage in conversation about the ideas they were working on. These conferences, along with the triannual Solvay conferences that had begun in the early 1900s, became an essential part of the scholarly conversation in physics that would shape the work on the ideas at the heart of the dual revolutions in physics in the early part of the 20th century: relativity theory and quantum theory. Bohr's conferences were significantly less formal than the Solvay conferences, which were run by Heinrich Lorentz in a manner in keeping with Europe's sense of structure, hierarchy, and class distinction. Few differences were made between graduate students and full professors at the Bohr conferences. Most of the participants were young, and the discussion was about the ideas, with anyone allowed to ask questions or make remarks. It was in these meetings that the fullness of quantum theory was worked out between the wunderkind of theoretical physics. As an illustration of this, there's the story of Paul Ehrenfest and his student Heinrich Casimir. As the two were traveling to the first 1929 conference, Ehrenfest is said to have told his 20-year-old student, quote, "Now you are going to know Niels Bohr, and that is the most important thing to happen in the life of a young physicist," unquote. When Ehrenfest made the introduction at breakfast the following morning, he said to Bohr, quote, "I'm bringing you this boy. He already has some ability, but he still needs thrashing," unquote. Bohr was impressed with Casimir over the course of the meeting, and as it finished, the director asked the young student to stay for a while. That visit lasted for another 2 years. In this quote, too, we find another aspect of Bohr's personality as a scientist. He was unflagging in his insistence that a fellow physicist understand and be able to explain the basis for the ideas they had. He had this trademark phrase, "I do not mean to be critical, only to learn." Of course, he applied this expectation to himself as much as to any of his colleagues, and when he worked out a paper, he would go back over his own ideas again and again in order to make sure he understood what things rested on solid experimental evidence and which ideas were conjecture. In this process, he was known for commandeering a young student, known around the Institute as the victim, to take notes of his thoughts while he paced around and talked through his ideas. While such work could be difficult, the students so tapped expressed that they learned an incalculably valuable lesson in seeing the rigorous thought process of a man like Bohr. As a man of enormous physical and mental energy, he could wear down another physicist, as was the case when Erwin Schrödinger first visited the Institute. As I will discuss in a later episode, Schrödinger was one of the first of a new generation of physicists to question Bohr's version of quantum theory. When he came to work with Bohr for a time, Bohr was relentless in asking Schrödinger to clarify his ideas, never allowing a single point to go unchallenged. Before long, exhausted by the process, Schrödinger took a bit ill. Even then, after some ministering to his condition by Marguerite, Bohr came to sit by Schrödinger's bedside to continue the interrogation. It was said that even in his 50s and beyond, Bohr was wearing out young men half his age. As I will have further episodes on the development of a fuller quantum mechanical model of the atom, I will leave a discussion of the science found therein to those episodes. In this supplemental, I'd like to keep the focus on the life of Bohr and the broad scope of his work and how it affected and influenced the bigger flow of developments in physics and, in time, the wider world. To do this, I want to spend just a bit of time talking about Bohr's interactions with some of the other great scientists of the time. In this, I am greatly benefited by the book Faust in Copenhagen by Gino Segre. For those of you who are students of both European history and culture, let me give this book my highest recommendation. Seriously, add it to your reading or listening list and get to it soon. It captures a world tantalizingly close to us and nevertheless one mostly lost. I think it's a brilliant discussion of one of the most consequential years in modern European history, 1932, not only in terms of the science, but also in terms of the tragic turning point that is the rise of Hitler. The two men closest in age to Bohr were Paul Ehrenfest and Albert Einstein. Bohr's relationship with both men was warm and rich. Einstein, after meeting Bohr for the first time in 1920, wrote to him in a letter, quote, "Not often in this life has a person, by his mere presence, given me as much joy as you. Now I understand why Ehrenfest is so fond of you. I am now studying your great papers, and in doing so, when I get stuck somewhere, I have the pleasure of seeing your face before me, smiling and explaining." Unquote. Bohr's response to that letter was, quote, "It was one of the greatest experiences ever to meet you and talk with you, and I cannot express how grateful I am for all the friendliness with which you met me on my visit to Berlin. You cannot know how great a stimulus it was for me to have the long-hoped opportunity to hear your views on the questions that have occupied me. I shall never forget our talks." Unquote. The two men would remain close friends and continue a long exchange in correspondence regarding the development of quantum theory, something we are fortunate enough to retain today. In that same visit to Berlin, Bohr also met Lise Meitner for the first time. Meitner was a truly gifted female experimentalist who was struggling to find a place in the patriarchal German science community. Bohr circumvented the normal protocol and found time on his visit to give a lecture to Meitner's collected students absent of the usual German science bigwigs, in order to allow the students to be able to ask questions, something that was usually not allowed in the more prestigious seminars and colloquia in Germany at that time. Within the year, Meitner would travel to Copenhagen to return the favor, giving lectures there over her work in atomic physics. Notwithstanding his grilling of Schrödinger, Bohr also maintained close relationships with the vanguard of the next generation of physicists. In 1922, Bohr gave a series of 7 lectures in Göttingen, to which Max Born at the university there and Sommerfeld from Munich brought their best and brightest students. These lectures, sometimes known as the Bohr Festival lectures, were deeply impactful on the lives of the students who attended. Both Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli would shift the focus of their research to quantum mechanics. More importantly, they saw for the first time a very different way of doing physics than they had been trained to do in the universities of Germany. At the time in Germany, the approach to doing physics was to start with the equations that might describe a system. Then one would work out the consequences of those equations and apply them in as general a fashion as possible in order to say what the behavior of the system might be. It was a very sort of top-down approach. In Bohr's method, on the other hand, and in his work, what they were shown was a method that relied on physical intuition and description of the system that only brought in the appropriate mathematics at the end of the process. This approach frustrated them at times in that it didn't always seem as rigorous as they wanted it to be or as they thought it might need to be. But what it also showed them was that to make truly profound leaps in understanding new physical phenomena, it was sometimes necessary to throw out the rigid approach of basing everything in a mathematics developed for descriptions that might no longer be completely valid. This approach was rewarded at the end of 1922 when Bohr was given the Nobel Prize in Physics. Throughout the 1920s, Bohr worked to guide and develop quantum theory. Until 1925, this work followed a program established by he and Einstein. But as the difficulties with their picture began to mount, he embraced the work of a new generation of physicists who called into question his assumptions. While his scientific contributions to this reformulation were relatively minor, he hugely influenced the course of development in 2 ways. The first was that he created the environment at the Institute. It is difficult to imagine that such rapid progress would have taken place if the students of Born and Sommerfeld and others hadn't had a place to go and work, and then if their students hadn't had a place to learn from the great minds just a few years older than they. The second contribution was to guide the discussion of what quantum theory actually meant. We'll leave the details until later, but beginning in 1927 and working through about 1932, Bohr, in his probing questioning and insistence on clear explanation, developed what is known as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. In this work, it would be Rutherford's student from Cambridge, Paul Dirac, who would provide the mathematical foundation that separated quantum theory from classical approaches once and for all. As Hitler came to power in early 1933, and those of Jewish descent were banned from holding posts in publicly financed positions, Bohr began to work to find a way for Jewish scientists to emigrate from Germany, Austria, and Italy to positions in other nations. In this work, the Institute was the perfect place to offer scientists in transition temporary work and housing until a more permanent situation could be found. In this, he was helped tremendously by the Rockefeller Foundation, who funded many of the fellowships that first brought scientists to the Institute and then helped them emigrate. During this period, Bohr did work on developing a mathematical model for a compound nucleus in 1936, containing both neutrons and protons. When, in 1938, Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner first split the uranium nucleus while in Sweden, it was Bohr who brought the news and explanation of the discovery to the United States. Additionally, based on his 1936 model of the nucleus, Bohr was the first to understand that it was not the more common uranium-238 isotope that was undergoing fission, but the less abundant uranium-235 one. In April 1940, Germany invaded and occupied Denmark, but for a time, they allowed most of the public institutions to continue to do the work they had done. Bohr continued to provide a refuge for those who sought to flee Germany, as now the persecution moved beyond those who were Jewish to other groups thought to be threatening to the Nazi regime. A number of Bohr's earlier colleagues and students remained in Germany and became part of the war effort there, participating in an atomic energy effort. While the initial research was merely to understand the process of nuclear fission and create a contained and controllable self-sustained reaction, it quickly turned towards the idea of producing weapons. Among those involved in the project was Werner Heisenberg, whose involvement and legacy have been hotly debated by historians ever since. While many claim that Heisenberg was a willing contributor as head of the atomic energy project, Heisenberg himself maintained that he did what he could to alert those outside of Germany as to the project's progress. In support of this, Heisenberg pointed to a 1941 meeting in Copenhagen, where he asked Bohr to meet him for a few minutes outside, away from the ears of other German participants who might have reported back to the secret police. Heisenberg, in his memoirs, claimed that he tried to talk to Bohr about the project's progress and about the morality of continuing the war when Bohr abruptly terminated the conversation. Bohr, along with one of Heisenberg's students, claimed that all Heisenberg did was try to talk with Bohr about negotiating a peace between Germany and Britain, with no mention of progress towards building an atomic weapon. When, in 1943, protests against the Nazi occupation of Denmark reached a level the German government was unwilling to accept, martial law was declared, and the anti-Jewish measures that had already been implemented in Germany and Poland were put into place. Getting word that he and his wife were to be arrested within a few days, Bohr was spirited out of Denmark to neutral Sweden in a private boat. Upon arriving in that country, Bohr is said to have met with Sweden's King Gustav V, and he convinced him to make public the willingness of Sweden to accept all Jewish refugees, something that was done the very next day. With this announcement, the Danish resistance ferried over 7,000 people of Jewish descent across the Baltic and into Sweden. Bohr was convinced to relocate to Britain and was transported out of Sweden and over Nazi-controlled Norway in a high-altitude de Havilland bomber. Upon reaching Britain, Bohr became a part of that nation's atomic energy team, and then, when Britain and the United States merged their efforts, he became a consultant for the Los Alamos Project, going by the secret code name Mr. Baker. Oppenheimer wrote that while Bohr's work was on the periphery of the project in most cases, he provided for the younger researchers a scientific father figure, most notably Richard Feynman, who, after the war, would pick up Paul Dirac's research program. While Bohr denied having offered much in the way of specific help for the project, Oppenheimer recounted that Bohr made some key suggestions that allowed the theory group with the project to solve one of the last major hurdles to construction of the weapon. Bohr, however, was deeply conflicted by the project. He felt that if only one political power had access to the technology, it would create an imbalance that would lead to continued warfare and additional tragic loss of life. He urged both Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt to share the work being done with counterparts in the Soviet Union. While the idea was considered at the Hyde Park meeting between the two men in September of 1944, it was rejected, and Bohr was placed under additional surveillance to make sure he didn't communicate any information to Russian scientists. For his part, Bohr was astute enough to understand that any action he took needed to be in concert with the leadership of the war effort, and he never made any attempt to pass information over to those Soviet scientists. When the war ended, Bohr returned to Denmark and reestablished the Institute. In 1950, he addressed the United Nations regarding the need for cooperations on issues of atomic energy, and when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon, the International Atomic Energy Agency was created along the lines of Bohr's suggestions. He would spend the rest of his life working towards the peaceful use of atomic energy and creating structures to restrain the possibility of war involving atomic weapons. In addition to this work, as Western Europe finally began to recover from the war as a result of the Marshall Plan, there was a realization that with the advent of big science, first hinted at as Europe moved towards war, the smaller governments of Europe would not be able to compete with the projects sponsored in the United States and Soviet Union. As such, it was decided that it was necessary for the nations of the European Economic Community to pool their resources to create research facilities along the lines of the national lab system being developed in the United States. This organization, known as the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN, was created in 1952 with its temporary theoretical headquarters in Denmark at the Institute. Eventually, CERN would be headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, with Bohr's support. When the headquarters opened in 1957, the Scandinavian countries created the Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen with Bohr as its chair. Bohr would remain in this position until his death from heart failure in 1962. In closing, I would like to note that while Bohr made foundational contributions to our understanding of both the atom and our understanding of the nature of the universe in developing quantum theory, his greatest accomplishment wasn't done on a chalkboard with equations. His greatest accomplishment, I think, was to create a space where all of that great work happened. Over and over in their memoirs, the great theorists of the day remarked that it was Bohr that was the most important figure in the physics revolutions of the early 1900s. While Einstein did more groundbreaking research, it was Bohr that shepherded the many physicists and their careers at the Institute. They grew not only to respect, but to love him in the way he extolled them to do great work, while also providing a place to do that work in an intellectually safe and nurturing environment. That he could bring together such diverse personalities as Einstein, Heisenberg, Pauli, Schrödinger, Ehrenfest, and Dirac, and channel their creative energy towards developing a description of the universe that so challenged the classical notions that served physics well up until the turn of the 20th century, is without question his greatest legacy. In physics, we live in a universe largely of Bohr's description. Without his sense of vision, we would have no desktop computers or cell phones. Atomic energy might not exist, nor would the Standard Model of the universe, which was developed by the students of those men who first came to the Institute in Copenhagen and who studied there themselves. The CERN Supercollider is a product of the collaboration Bohr spent a great deal of his energy on in his later years. Of all of the scientific figures in the 20th century, I find Bohr the most laudable and likable. As a physicist, I wish I could have met him, worked at the Institute under his tutelage. He wasn't the most intellectually gifted of the generation that rewrote physics, nor was he as notorious as those he worked with at times. But he, more than anyone else I've read about, even Rutherford, built a space where human beings could truly flourish. He created a place that allowed himself and others to achieve that greatest of virtues in Greek thought. In his presence and with his guidance, several generations of physicists, chemists, and even biologists bloomed into truly gifted scientists. It is, as far as I can tell, a thing unique in the history of science, and a testament to his spirit as well as his intellect. In our next episode, we'll take a look at developments in chemistry and physics just prior to and following Bohr's work on the atom. It was work that finally explained Mendeleev's table and began to expose the idea that Bohr's work had only scratched the surface of, and that was what was really going on with light and matter. So until then, full sails on your journey.